He saved an enemy and was sentenced to death for it. Peter Blood never intended to become a pirate. He didn't want to fight, overthrow the king, or take part in any conspiracy. While England was drawing in the blood of rebellion, he was quietly at home, minding his own business. But one day a badly wounded man was brought to him, and this was where Blood made a fatal mistake. He chose to act like a doctor. The wounded man turned out to be a rebel who had fought against King James II. Blood knew exactly who he was treating, but he could not simply leave a dying man without help. He bandaged his wounds and tried to save his life, and that was the exact moment when soldiers came into this house. The authorities do not ask whether Blood took part in the rebellion. They do not care whether he ever held a weapon. It doesn't matter that he was not a rebel at all. He treated an enemy of the king, then he must be an enemy himself. Blood is arrested. And suddenly a respected doctor becomes a traitor to the state. Then comes to the trial where justice has very little to do with his happening. A death sentence. Then an even more unexpected fate. A man who spent his life saving people is sent across the ocean and sold into slavery. And that is how the story of one of the most famous pirates in literature begins. Because sometimes becoming a criminal does not require killing anyone, stealing anything, or even breaking the law. Sometimes all it takes is being in the wrong place with the wrong person and trying to save their life. But the most interesting part is still ahead, because the very authorities who turned Peter Blood into a slave will soon create a man the entire Caribbean will learn to fear. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. That way you'll help spread the word and support the growth of the community. You're watching Rubber Books channel. Let's begin! The doctor who became a traitor. Peter Blood was not a pirate yet. He had no ship, no crew, no famous name, and not the slightest thought that one day he would become a captain, feared by the Spanish and the French. He was a doctor, and the very profession that should have saved his life and given him the right to remain human would one day turn him into a criminal. In 1685, England was swept up to the rebellion of the Duke of Monmouth against King James II. The rebellion was crushed, and what followed was a brutal campaign against anyone suspected of having taken part in it. It was during this period that Peter Blood did something that, from a doctor's point of view, was perfectly natural. He treated a wounded man, but to the victorious authorities. That man was a rebel, and helping him could therefore be interpreted as taking part in a crime against the state. Blood was arrested, and this is where one of the central ideas of the entire novel begins. A person may commit no crime at all. Yet those in power can declare the very act of showing humanity to be a crime. Blood is brought to trial, and the judge presiding over the proceedings, George Jeffreys, becomes one of the most notorious symbols of the era. After the rebellion was crushed, they oversaw a series of trials that became known as the Bloody Assizes. Thousands of people were punished, with many sentenced to death or transportation. The proceedings were so brutal that those accused could hardly expect anything resembling a fair trial. And now Peter Blood finds himself standing before the system. His crime is simple: he helped a rebel. But once you stop and think about what he actually did, an absurd question emerges. What exactly was a doctor supposed to do when faced with a badly wounded man? Ask about his political beliefs first. Find out which king he had fought for? and only then decide whether he deserved medical treatment, right? For Blood, the answer was obvious. A doctor treats the wounded because, above all, he is looking at a human being. But after the rebellion, the state cared less about human life than political allegiance. That is why the accusation against Blood becomes so important to everything that follows. For the first time, he comes face to face with a system in which law and justice have become two completely different things. And author Sabatini deliberately does not portray Blood as a man who has always dreamed of defying the state. Quite the opposite. He is educated, professional, self-confident, and respectable. He is pulled into the story simply because he refuses to betray his own conscience. It is not a conscious choice that turns him into a criminal. He becomes a criminal because those in power decide to call his actions a crime. And then something even more horrifying happens. Instead of receiving an ordinary punishment, well, like ordinary death, it's not ordinary. Blood is sent into slavery. His fate is no longer decided as the fate of a free man, it is decided as the fate of property. Yesterday he was a doctor, a man with a profession, reputation, and a place in society. Now he can be sold. And this is where the first part of Peter's Blood story ends, with its most brutal paradox. He wanted nothing more than to treat people, yet he was condemned as a traitor to the state and sent across the ocean as a slave. But the most interesting part is that the very authorities who wanted to break him actually creating the man they will soon be forced to reckon with. Because if Blood there had never been condemned, never been sold, and never been stripped of his freedom, there would have been no Captain Blood. If, main, if, you know. The irony is almost perfect. The king wanted to punish one doctor and instead created his own future enemy. Sold as a slave, Arabella, and the first humiliation. So, Peter Blood arrives in Barbados no longer as a free man, but as a convict who can be sold. For a man who only recently had lived by his own profession and determined his own fate, it's almost a complete destruction of his identity. He had not simply been deprived of his freedom, he had been turned into property. In Barbados, Blood is purchased by Colonel Bishop, one of the island's influential plantation owners, and this is where an entirely different life begins. Instead of practicing medicine, he faces hard labor. Instead of respect, he gets orders. Instead of making his own decisions, he must obey his master's will. But Bishop quickly realizes that he has not bought an ordinary slave. Standing before him is an educated man with medical knowledge, a strong character, and most irritating of all, a sense of his own dignity. Oh, what a irritate history. Blood may have never been legally stripped of his freedom, but he has no intention of becoming submissive on the inside. That's why the relationship with Bishop stands from the very beginning. The colonel is accustomed to dealing with people he can command and control. Blood, however, continued to speak to him almost as an equal. And this reveals one of the hero's defining traits, and an extraordinary ability to preserve his dignity even when the circumstances demand submission. But Barbados brings Blood more than humiliation. Here he meets Arabella Bishop, the colonel's daughter. Their first encounter is far from romantic. Arabella sees before her a man who is technically her father's property. To her, he is first and foremost a convict, a man with a tarnished reputation, someone already branded a criminal. Blood, meanwhile, sees in her a representative of the very world that has just taken away his freedom. So from the beginning there is no tenderness between them, but conflict. One moment is particularly revealing when Arabella essentially accuses him of theft. To Blight, it's almost an insult to common sense. First, they strip him of his freedom, send him into slavery, and then they treat him as though he were a person of inferior status. Instead of quietly accepting the humiliation, Blood responds with the trademark irony. And this is a crucial detail of his character. He does not become some gloomy victim who spends his time complaining about his fate. On the contrary, the worse his situation becomes, the sharper his tongue becomes. Humor is not merely part of his personality, it's a way of preserving his inner freedom. They can take away his clothes, his status, money, and his freedom of movement, but as long as he can answer with a mocking remark to someone who considers the same superior to him, Blood remains himself. That is why his relationship with the rebel is built on contradiction from the very beginning. She sees a criminal who deserves the position he had been given. He sees a young woman judging him without knowing almost anything about him. And the more tension develops between them, the stronger the future conflict becomes between who Blood really is and the image others have created of him. Blood knows that he's not the criminal they have declared him to be. Arabella does not know that yet. To her, the label attached to his name matters more than the man standing in front of her. That's Blood's first real humiliation. He is forced to prove his decency to people who have already decided that he has known. But this also where fate begins to take another unexpected turn. Blood may be a slave, but his medical skill soon becomes valuable even to the people who owns him as a property. And when a new threat reaches to the island, his position changes within a matter of hours. A Spanish attack destroys the family order of Barbados. People who only yesterday regarded Blood as a convict suddenly find themselves facing a man capable of acting when everyone else is lost in the chaos. And that chaos will give him the first real opportunity to do something he could never have done on land: escape from another man's property and reclaims his freedom. The escape that created Captain Blood. Barbados suddenly finds itself facing a Spanish threat. For Peter Blood, this is the moment when the old order collapses, and with it comes the one opportunity he has to change his fate. The Spanish attack the island, panic spreads, and Blood finds himself among people who are far too busy dealing with the crisis to keep watch over every move of a convict. But what happens next is even more important. Blood ends up among other prisoners, including men who could become a crew. For most of them, this is simply chaos and danger. For Blood, it's an opportunity he cannot afford to miss. He quickly realizes that if he remains in Barbados, he will eventually fall back under Bishop's control. So the question is no longer whether he wants freedom, but whether he can take it. Blood and his companions seize a ship and gain the chance to leave the island, but there is a crucial difference between an ordinary escape and what happens to Blood. He does not simply save himself, other men begin to follow him. Yesterday he was a convict controlled by a plantation owner. Today people are beginning to recognize him as their leader. And he doesn't become a captain because he has always dreamed of the sea or spent years preparing for a life of piracy. The situation itself making him a captain. He has knowledge, composure, the ability to make decisions under pressure, and most importantly, the ability to make other people believe that he knows what he's doing. This is where the transformation of the hero becomes especially fascinating. His medical profession does not disappear, quite the opposite. His medical knowledge continues to help both him and his men. But now it's joined by an entirely different set of skills. The ability to command, calculate risks, negotiate, and make decisions when a single mistake could cost the entire crew their lives. Yet freedom brings a new problem with blood, and his men cannot simply return to normal life, yeah? They are escaped convicts. To the authorities, they are criminals. Their ships effectively becomes their only home, and the sea the only place where they can remain free. And here we encounter one of the novel's central paradoxes. Blood gains his freedom, but the freedom automatically places him outside the law. To live independently, he has to seize other ships and find a way to survive at sea. This is how he begins to transform into the Captain Blood, who will soon become known throughout the Caribbean. But Blood does not see himself as an ordinary pirate. To him, there is a fundamental difference between mindless robbery and fighting those who themselves pose a threat. He tries to follow his own rules, refusing to turn every capture into senseless brutality. His men gradually become more than a group of fugitives. They become a real crew. And that's perhaps the greatest result of the escape. Blood gains not only freedom, but responsibility for the freedom of others. Now every decision he makes affects more than just himself. If he makes a mistake, his men may die. If he shows weakness, they may be captured. If he trusts the wrong person, they may be betrayed. The novel therefore gradually transforms Blood from a man pursued by fate into a man who begins to take control of his own destiny. The irony is that the very system that tried to turn him into a slave creates a captain instead. A man who once slaved leaves one land is now forced to survive at sea. A doctor becomes a fugitive, the fugitive becomes a commander, and the commander becomes a man who will soon be called a pirate. But this is only the beginning. Blood is not yet a legend. He still has to prove that he can survive in a world where several powerful nations may soon stand against him. And before long, he will have to decide what he truly is. A criminal simply fighting for his own survival, or a man who will create his own code and live by it, even after the entire world has already branded him a pirate. The Pirate by Necessity: How Blood Became a Legend of the Caribbean. With the ship and his freedom finally in his hands, Peter Blood is forced to face an unpleasant truth. Freedom by itself doesn't give a man the chance to live peacefully. He's an escaped convict, he cannot return to England, and in the Caribbean he's wanted man. Yeah. To keep his ship and crew alive, he had to do things that gradually turned him into a pirate. But this is where Blood differs from most of the men he's now being compared to. He doesn't romanticize piracy or turn plunder into a way of life. He wants something else: to survive, to remain free, and never allow himself to be turned into a slave again. That's why his actions constantly fall somewhere between piracy and warfare. He chooses his targets carefully, often going after those with those he's already at odds, taking advantage of political circumstances, and tries to avoid pointless brutality. Blood quickly proves that his greatest weapon is not brute force but his mind. He knows how to assess a situation, spot an enemy's weakness, and make his opponent believe exactly what Blood wants him to believe. To him, a sea battle is not simply a clash between ships, it's a game of chess in which victory can be decided before the first shot is fired. That's why his reputation begins to grow. One successful capture follows another, and the name Captain Blood becomes known across the islands. He may look like a pirate, yet his position remains deeply unusual. He does not behave like a man who simply does not care what happens to anyone else. He can be ruthless where circumstances demand it, but he never becomes a mindless killer. He follows a code of his own based above all on practicality, discipline, and a sense of justice. And it's precisely this code that allows him to keep his crew together. His men follow Blood not merely because he can lead them to riches, but they see him as a captain who will not sacrifice his own people for personal gain. Gradually, another important paradox emerges. The more successful Blood becomes, the less he resembles the criminal England declared him to be. Yet, the more honorably he acts, the louder his reputation as a pirate becomes. The world sees the result: captured ships, valuable prizes, and armed crew. Very few people care about the reason behind it, and the reason is simple. The state itself once pushed Blood outside the law. Now he lives in that vault and is forced to play by its rules. What makes this especially interesting is the way Sabatini constantly plays with the very meaning of the word pirate. To everyone around him, the label is enough. If a man captures ships, he's a pirate. For Blood, the situation is far more complicated. He believes his circumstances were created not by greed but by injustice. He did not choose exile, he did not choose slavery, and he certainly did not choose to become a captain. But once he has won his freedom, he has no intention of surrendering it willingly. That's why its story becomes more than an adventure about sea battles. It becomes the story of a man fighting to preserve his right to decide for himself who he will be. And the further he goes, the stronger the contradiction becomes. The law considers him as a criminal. His enemies see him as a dangerous pirate. His crew see him as a leader, while Blood himself still thinks of himself as a man who has simply driven into a corner. But the Caribbean Sea doesn't forgive mistakes, and the Spanish are not his only problem. There are French, the English governors, military commanders, and other captains, other pirates, each pursuing interests of their own. Blood therefore had to do more than fight. He may constantly maneuver between rival powers, from temporary alliances, deceive his enemies, and figure out who will be an enemy tomorrow. A legend, however, that means something different to everyone who hears it. To some, he is a dangerous pirate, to others, a brilliant captain, to his men, he is the man who gave them their freedom, but to Blood himself, it is still much more practical. He is simply trying to survive in a world that made him a criminal in the first place. The more famous he becomes, however, the harder it is for him to remain unnoticed. Soon he will no longer be hunted by individual ships, but by men representing the interests of entire empires. The hunt for blood, victories, traps, and dangerous alliances. By this point, Captain Blood is no longer simply an escaped convict. His name is known throughout the Caribbean, and with that fame comes a new problem. Now people want to capture him not merely because he has broken the law, but because he has become too dangerous an opponent to ignore. Blood finds himself in a world where the Spanish, French, English are fighting in one another, making temporary alliances and breaking them just as quickly, while a single captain can be a valuable ally today and an enemy tomorrow. The Blood understands the most important rule of this world: you can trust almost no one. That's why his greatest strength is not the seas of his crew or the power of his ships, but his ability to exploit the divisions between his enemies. He waits for the moment when an opponent feels more confident of victory, and that is precisely when he strikes. The Spanish consider him an enemy. French can regard him as a reliable partner, and the English authorities would happily see him back in chains. But Blood now know how to make each of other temporarily play by his rules. That is the sense of his strategy. He does not try to defeat the entire Caribbean all once. He uses circumstances to his advantage. If his enemies are fighting among themselves, he takes advantage of it. If an opponent believes Blood is too far away, he appears exactly where he is least expected. If his enemy is preparing for a straightforward confrontation, Blood chooses deception instead. That's why his victories can sometimes seem almost impossible. But Sabatini continually shows that they are not the result of magical luck, but observes carefully, draws conclusions quickly, and knows how to make a decision in the precise moment when another man would still be hesitating. At that same time, his crew becomes increasingly organized. The men know that the captain will not send them to die for no reason or sacrifice them for his own advantage. That's why discipline aboard his ships is so unusual for a pirate crew. Blood has his own rules, and breaking those rules can have consequences. To him, his crew is not a mob that must control through fear, but a team on which his own survival depends. Yet the more victories Blood wins, the more complicated his position becomes. Rich prizes attracted attention. Success creates envy, and the political situation is constantly shifting. Blood is forced to make alliances with men he would never trust under normal circumstances. Sometimes he works with people he considered enemies only yesterday because he benefits both sides. But in the Caribbean, such alliances are always temporary. Every partner is simply waiting for the moment when he can gain the upper hand. Upon understands this perfectly, that's why he constantly calculates not only what his enemies are likely to do, but what his allies might do as well. As a result, his adventures become much more than a simple sequence of sea battles. We are now watching a genuine political game, except that instead of palace halls, the battlefield is made up of ships' decks and island harbors. And here it is especially important to distinguish Sabatini's novel from actual history. Peter Blood is a fictional character, not in an exact biography of a specific historical person. Sabatini, however, deliberately places him within a real historical area, using genuine political conflicts, the geography of the Caribbean, the rivalry between England, Spain, and France, and the atmosphere of the late 17th century. That's why the novel works on two levels at once. It's an adventure story, but its hero exists within a recognizable historical world, and the more Blood wins, the more his status changes. Once he was sold a slave, now powerful enemies have to reckon with a man capable of outsmarting opponents far more powerful than himself. But there is one problem that neither Kenner's nor clever tactics can solve. Blood may defeat a Spanish captain, deceive the French, or escape an English pursuit, but he cannot so easily change the opinion of one particular person. Arabella Bishop. In her eyes, his past remains proof that he is nothing more than a pirate, and the more deeply Blood becomes attached to Arabella, the more painful the gap becomes between the man he knows himself to be and the man she believes him to be. Arabella, pride, and the price of reputation. The entire Caribbean, Captain Blight is gradually become almost legendary. His name inspires fear in his enemies and respect among his crew. But there is one person, as we said, whom all of that reputation means almost nothing. That's Arabella Bishop. And that is precisely why her part in Blood's story becomes more painful to him than any sea battle. When they first met, Arabella saw a convict and a man whom the law had declared a criminal. Blood, meanwhile, saw the daughter of the man who owned him as a property. From the very beginning, there is more than a social divide between them. They may have completely different ideas about who Blood really is. He knows the circumstances of his conviction and understands that political circumstances turned him into a criminal. Arabella did not witness any of that, and she never knew the man Blood had been before Barbados. To her, his name gradually becomes associated with piracy, danger, and bloody adventures. And his creatures were human conflict. It's not enough for Blood simply to become free. He wants Arabella to recognize that he was never the man everyone believed him to be. But he cannot prove that with a single heroic act. Every new victory only seems to confirm her original opinion. The more successful Blood becomes as a captain, the more he looks exactly like the pirate she believes him to be. That's the cruel irony of his fate. He's trying to prove that he's not a criminal, yet circumstances constantly force him to do things that look criminal from the outside. Blood can be noble, generous, and fiercely loyal to his men, but someone looking at him from a distance sees the captured ships and the armed crew first. Through Arabella, Sabatini explores the power of reputation. Reputation is the image of a person in other people's eyes, and sometimes their image becomes stronger than reality itself. Once Blood has been branded a criminal, he continues to carry that label even when his own actions contradict it. That's why the relationship between Blood and Arabella cannot be reduced to a simple love story. And it's hurt, pride, prejudice, and the desire to be understood for who you really are. Blood is too proud to humiliate himself by constantly defending and explaining himself. Arabella is too confident in her first impression to immediately take his side. Their relationship therefore remains tense. He wants her to see the real Blood, while she sees Captain Blood first, a man living outside the law. And the more deeply Blood becomes attached to her, the more important her opinion becomes. With everyone else, he can afford his irony. He can laugh at accusations, deceive an enemy, risk his ships, and even put his own life on the line. But when it comes to Arabella, his usual confidence begins to crack. Because there is no longer about winning. You cannot force someone to respect you. You cannot capture a ship and order someone to change their opinion of you. You cannot defeat another person's prejudice with one clever maneuver. That's why Arabella becomes a test Blood cannot pass using the methods that normally serve him so well. And there is another important detail. Blood does not stop being himself just to win her affection. He does not abandon his character to become some convenient hero willing to sacrifice everything for love. His pride remains an essential part of who he is. That's why the conflict between them never completely disappears. He wants her recognition, but he refuses to buy it at the price of his dignity. Arabella wants to see him as someone she can trust, but her image of him has been shaped too strongly by his reputation. As a result, Blood finds himself in a strange position. To his enemies, he is too dangerous. To his crew, he is too valuable. And to Arabella, he is still not good enough. But while their personal conflict continues, England itself changing. The political events that once turned Blood into a criminal begin to move in the opposite direction. King James II loses his throne, the political order changes, and with it comes an opportunity Blood has almost stopped expecting. For the first time in years, fate may be ready to give him back what was taken from him, but now Blood must decide what matters more. Continuing to live as a free man outside the law, taking advantage of the change in power and attempting to reclaim his name, his position, and the right to live as an ordinary man. This is where the story of Captain Blood reaches the most unexpected turning point. The man who was once sold as a slave will soon become useful to the very authorities that declared him a criminal. The final great game. from pirate to the man who decides the fate of islands. Everything that happened to Peter Blood up to this point began with a single political catastrophe, Mormont's rebellion, and the brutal suppression that followed it. That was when he was branded a criminal, stripped of his freedom, and sent to Barbados. But now the story takes an unexpected turn. The political situation in England changes, and with it comes a change in the status of people who has once been considered enemies of the state. After the glorious revolution of 1688, James II loses his throne, and William III and Mary II become the new monarchs of England. Suddenly, the man the previous regime sent into slavery is no longer necessarily a criminal in the eyes of the new government. For Blood, there is more than a change of kings. It's a chance to reclaim what was taken from his years earlier: his legal status, freedom, and his own name. But before he can finally return to anything resembling normal life, Blood becomes involved in the final major events of the novel. His experience, reputation, and military ability are now valuable not only to himself. Political changes are affecting the Caribbean as well, where governors, military commanders, and colonial authorities must decide whom they serve and how to act in completely new political reality. Blood, who was once forced to live outside the law, can now use his abilities in an entirely different way. And this is where he can see just how far he has come from the man George Jeffreys once judged. He is no longer the frightened doctor trying to explain to a court why he treated a wounded rebel. He is no longer the convict who can be sold to a plantation owner. He is no longer the fugitive who has only just seized a ship. He is now an experienced commander who knows the sea, knows how to lead men, and can make decisions when the stakes are far greater than his own life. But the most interesting thing in the Blood does not suddenly fall in love with power. His character remains unchanged. He still values freedom and has no tolerance for pointless tyranny. That's why his return to the lawful world is not a simple fairy tale story about a good man finally received the reward he deserves. Instead, it raises a deeper question: what does it actually mean to be a law-abiding man? A few years earlier, the law had declared Blood a criminal. Now, a different political order effectively changes his status. Blood himself has barely changed. The law changed. The government changed. The political interpretation of his past changed, and this is one of the novels. And this is one of the novel's most powerful ideas. Sometimes the label of criminal depends not only on what a person has done, but on who currently has the power to declare him a criminal. But the final part of the story, Blood finds himself into a position that would have seemed impossible only a short time earlier. The man who was once sold as a property can now influence the face of a colony. His knowledge and authority are suddenly valuable. He gets the opportunity to leave the world of piracy not through defeat or capture, but because a political revolution has changed the very system that once haunted him. And he's complete the first great arc of his story. Blood began as a doctor who treated a wounded rebel. He was punished for it, then he became a slave. Slavery forced him to fight for his freedom. Freedom took him to set sea. The sea made him a captain, and Captain Blood gradually became a man who no one could afford to ignore. Now his past unexpectedly becomes his greatest advantage. All those years that once seemed like exile and punishment have given him experience that most men in official positions could never possess. He knows the sea, he knows enemies, he knows the price of betrayal, he knows how to command, and most importantly, he knows what happens when power loses its humanity. That's why Blood's final victory is not simply that He regains his freedom, he earns the chance to return to the society that once rejected him, now as a completely different man. And of course, there is still Arabella, because winning his freedom turns out to be far easier for Blood than raising his part from her mind. Political authority can change a man's status with a single decision. Human opinion changes much more slowly. And so the ending has to answer two questions at once. Can Blood return from the world of criminals to the world of lawful men? And can the man the entire world once branded a pirate finally prove who he really was? The ending and the hidden meanings of Captain Blood's Odyssey. At the end of Captain Blood's Odyssey, something happens that would have seemed impossible at the beginning of the novel. The man who have tried as a criminal, sold as a slave, and hunted as a pirate regains his freedom and his lawful position in society. After the change of power in England, Blood's past no longer makes him an enemy of the state. In fact, his abilities prove so valuable that the former convict is given the opportunity to hold a position of authority in Barbados. And this is one of the novel's greatest ironies. Peter Blood does not become a different man. What changes is the way people see him. At the beginning of the story, the law says, he's a criminal. By the end, that same world effectively acknowledges that he is worthy of respect and authority. And this is forces Sabatini to confront us with a simple but uncomfortable question. If the man can be considered a criminal yesterday and a respectable public figure today, how reliable is the line between legality and justice in the first place? Blood remains a man with his own code throughout the entire story. He may break the law, but does not necessarily mean he breaks his moral principles. And that is what it makes his character so paradoxical. A law-abiding man can behave without humanity, when an outlaw can turn out to be far more honorable than the people who represented the law. Think back to the beginning. Did Blood commit a crime? Formally, the authorities said yes, but what did he actually do? He treated a wounded man. His guilt did not come from cruelty or greed, it came from the political circumstances surrounding him. And from that point on, his entire life became a chain reaction set off by that first unjust decision. He is sent into slavery, and slavery forces him to fight for his freedom. He becomes a fugitive and is forced to live in the sea. He becomes a captain and is forced to seize ships. He becomes a famous pirate, even though he never dreamt of becoming one. It creates an almost perfect vicious circle. The authorities first create a criminal and then use his criminal status as proof that he is dangerous. But the novel does not turn Blood into a saint. That's important. He is capable of ruthless decisions, deception, manipulation, and violence when he considers them necessary. Author Sabatini is not saying that breaking the law automatically makes someone a good person. The idea is much more complicated. A person's morality cannot be determined by a legal definition alone. That's why Blood is more interesting than the typical hero of adventure novel. He constantly exists between two worlds. To the law, he is a criminal. To his crew, he is captain. To his enemies, he is dangerous opponent. To himself, he is simply a man who refused to let others take away his freedom completely. Even his relationship with Arabella becomes part of the larger theme. It is not enough for Blood to be pardoned by the king. He wants Arabella herself to hear him who he really is. Because official recognize can restore a person's title, position, social standing, but it cannot automatically erase the image that another person has formed in their mind. There is something remarkably modern about this idea. Reputation can become more powerful than facts. If a person is called a criminal for long enough, people begin to accept the label as truth. And conversely, when there is an power declares someone a hero, society can quickly begin to see that person is an entirely different light. Blood's fate is built around this irony. Yesterday his name meant criminal, today it means hero. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to put your like, leave a comment, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. See you soon.